Giving feedback on student writing when less is more. Judi Landrum. Giving feedback on student writing is time-consuming, and the advice seems to sometimes get lost in the abyss. The objective of this workshop is to give faculty some tips for spending minimal time but garnering maximum benefit when giving feedback to CAPS, seminary, and grad school students on their writing. So the objectives for workshop participants are: 1, gain an awareness of research-based strategies for responding to student writing. 2, use selected strategies for responding to student writing. And 3, use strategies for responding to writing which maximizes the time you spend and also maximize the benefit for the students. So I'm going to start with a little story that maybe you've heard before. So about a 9-10-year-old daughter is watching her mom cook, and mom's making ham. She cuts off the end of the ham, puts it in the pan, and then puts the pan in the oven. And the 10-year-old says, "Mom, how come you always cut off the end of the ham when you put the ham into the oven?" And the mom said, "I don't know. That's the way my mom always did it." So mom calls grandma and says, "Mom, when you make a ham, how come you always cut the end off the ham, put it in the pan, and then put it in the oven?" And the grandma says, "I don't know. That's the way that my mom always did it." So grandma asked great-grandma, "Mom, when you made a ham, how you always cut off the end and put it in the pan and put it in the oven? Why is that?" And great-grandma said, "Because I only had one pan and it was too short, so I had to cut part of the ham off." Often, that's kind of the way that we respond to writing. What we do is we take the ways that people responded to us and helped us learn how to write better, as opposed to using more recent pans, which maybe actually would fit a better paradigm of the way that we do writing instruction practices. And so that's the nature of this. What things do we know now about responding to student writing that maybe we didn't know back when people were teaching us? And so I'm going to give you just a snippet of what some of that research is on responding to student writing. 1, comments on the final draft of students' writing exist primarily to justify the grade, but does little or nothing to improve the quality of student writing. 2, over 80% of students reported that their teachers talked to them about their writing. Students who reported their teachers either always or sometimes talked with them about their writing had higher average scores than those whose teachers did not talk to them or rarely talked to them. And by the same token, students whose teachers almost always talked to them about their writing during the process had higher scores than those whose teachers sometimes talked to them about their writing. 3, while revising, we know that expert writers revise globally as well as mechanics conventions, but novice writers, particularly our students, they will only revise looking at mechanical conventions. And even our college students will do the same thing. Even graduate students will only revise mechanical conventions unless, as a teacher, we scaffold them and train them in order to revise a little bit more globally. 4, peer response to writing works best when the writer and the responder have equal roles rather than when the responder takes more of the role of being an evaluator. 5, writing intervention is most effective when it's matched to an individual student's needs. One of the largest longitudinal studies on student writing, they found 3 key elements which had the largest impact on student growth. 1, the feedback is written to a specific writer in the text, not generic comments. 2, students must be willing and want to accept the feedback and have the opportunity to apply that feedback. 3, feedback and response has to be ongoing rather than just one hit-it-all-at-once writing class. So that's why some of you are saying, "I don't teach a writing class. I teach a content area class." We know that. But if they don't get some feedback to their writing in your very important content area classes, then that communication skill of writing will not improve. Now, 7th item. For the most part, students who are part of the dominant culture can glean writing skills and strategies and rules from implicit instruction. But students who are not part of the dominant culture and students who are English language learners need very explicit instruction in order to glean these writing skills. And actually, the explicit instructions are also valuable for people who are native speakers. Finally, making connections between students' writing and what they're reading exponentially increases their ability to write better and to read better. So, what can we summarize from all this research on feedback on student writing? And understand, I'm only giving you a small snippet, but the research does support all of the points that I've given you, even though I've given you only a small amount. So what can we summarize from this research? What we can summarize is we want to think that if we make a suggestion on paper A, that's going to carry over a month later when the student is writing paper B for another class. But that doesn't always work that way. What we know is students need feedback on their writing process and a grade on their writing product. What are the points at which you should give feedback? And understand that what I'm referencing now is a fairly large paper. If you're doing a one-page reflection paper, it's not going to be that valuable for you to give this level of feedback. It's overkill. But if your students are writing a fairly large, lengthy paper for your course, then you want to give them paper feedback at about 4 points. The first point is at the topic selection stage. So your students pick the topic they're writing about and hopefully a guiding question guiding their research or where their paper is going to go. That feedback for a whole class will take you less than an hour. Have them email that to you and quickly come back and say, too broad, too narrow, great topic, but you probably won't find the research on that topic or whatever else. Also, that gets our students thinking about their topic and thinking about the paper before the night before that the paper is due, which often we know happens. The second time that you want to give them feedback is at the partial draft stage, after they've written just a little bit of their paper. Then they need feedback at the rough draft, although sometimes it's more valuable if you say almost final draft as opposed to rough draft stage. And then on the very final page that they submit for grading, that's the one that you grade, but don't necessarily write comments on their paper. And I'll talk to you about that more in just a minute. So let's break those stages down. First, I already talked to you a little bit about topic selection and giving feedback at that stage. Now I want to spend some time talking about that partial draft and why you give feedback on the partial draft stage. So for example, ask your students to email you a partial draft, and you have to set up those deadlines in that very short window you have of either 5 weeks or 6 weeks or 8 weeks, depending on the course that you're teaching. So you respond to a partial draft, 3 to 5 paragraphs. Because in 3 to 5 paragraphs, you will see what are the patterns of errors and patterns of strengths in your students' writing. So when you respond to that partial draft, it's most helpful if you give them 2 to 3 things they're doing really well. Here are some strengths, and it can be things like, you have a very clearly stated thesis, and this is what the thesis is. Or it might be something like, your paragraphs are really well developed. Then in addition to giving them some strengths and encourage them on the things they're doing well, next, you want to give them some suggestions on things that they can do better. So you look at, okay, as a reader, what are the biggest errors that I see in the big picture, global area of their writing? And then if you're thinking, oh gosh, what should I look at? Go back to your rubric. What are the things that you have in your rubric and go to that? So I'm guessing on your rubric you have things on there like paragraph development. And so you might say, you've got all the information in the right paragraphs, but they need further development. Here's a way that you can do that. Or it might be something like, you have all the correct information in all the paragraphs, but maybe if we reorganize the sentences, it would more clearly get your point across to the reader. Items such as that. So you'll make global suggestions. Then in addition to the global, you'll say, okay, mechanical errors, what are the most egregious mechanical errors I'm seeing? Is it run-on sentences? Is it comma usage? Is it apostrophe usage? And then comment on that also. So what you're giving them is 2 to 3 things they're doing very well, and then anywhere from 3 to maybe not over 6 or 7 items that they need to focus on to improve their writing. Some of those need to be at the global level. Some of those will be more mechanical convention level. And you may say, yeah, but I looked at their paper, there's like 25 things they really need to do to make this paper better. And you're probably right. But let's be realistic. If you give them 25 things, they're going to go into cognitive overload and they're not going to be able to do any of them. And in addition to that, they're going to feel completely overwhelmed that they can't do this. So if you can focus on what those 3 to 5 or 3 to 7 things that are most important, that will be the most beneficial for your student. And if you're saying, okay, well, globally, how do I know what's the most important? As a reader, you will probably know that, and then go back to your rubric. If you're saying, yeah, but I don't know mechanics conventions, what are the bigger deal? Is it more important that I look at pronoun antecedent agreement, or is it more important that I'm looking at subject-verb agreement? What we have attached to this video is we have a link to a text which basically talks about levels of mechanical errors. And on that it will say, here are the most egregious errors. You want to cover these first. Once the students have mastered that one, then you go to the next level and then the next level. If you see an error one time, it's a typo. If you see it 4 or 5 times, then that means it's an ongoing error your student doesn't know. So that's the way that you want to respond to a partial draft. And you're probably thinking to yourself, okay, that sounds really good, but that's really time consuming. And you're right, it is. It's worth your time, but it's time consuming. Now, how can you reduce that time a little bit? The way that you can reduce the time is, so I'm responding to student A's paper. So I've got, Mary's one of my students. So I'm responding to Mary's paper and I give her 2 or 3 comments of things she's doing well, and then I give her 5 comments on things that she needs to improve on. Next, I go to Letitia's paper. And when I'm looking at Letitia's paper, I'm seeing, okay, out of the comments I made on Mary's paper, 4 of those will work on Letitia's paper. So what I do is I copy what I said to Mary, paste it on Letitia's, and then I make those 2 or 3 changes. So the things that are on Letitia's are probably 60% of the same things I'm saying to Mary, but I'm still giving Letitia individual feedback because that's what our research tells us is the most beneficial to our students. And then when I go on and I'm doing Juan's paper, then same thing. I may copy the comments I had from Mary or the comments from Letitia, put it on Juan's, and then make 2 or 3 changes that benefit his writing. So in the long run, you are using some of the same things for every single paper that you do, but then some of them are going to be different. Now, that's how you give feedback that's probably the most efficient and helpful for your students. In addition to that, it will be helpful if you give some whole class feedback on patterns that you are seeing in your entire class of what they're doing well, and again, things that they improve on. So similar to what you do with individuals, what you can do in a face-to-face class, or you can tape it for an online class, is ask a student for permission to use his or her work, then put his or her work up on a screen, and then go through and say, look at these things so-and-so is doing well. Clearly stated thesis right here. Notice that this first paragraph is supporting that thesis. So you're telling them things that the student is doing well. Then you can talk about things the student could do better. For example, notice in paragraph 2 here, all the right information is here, but it's a bit confusing. How could that be organized differently to be a little more clean? I wouldn't spend more than 10 or 15 minutes on that. Again, you can do a video for online, or you can do that in a face-to-face class instruction, or you can create the video to use online or face-to-face, whatever works best for you. But I strongly suggest you work from student text, of course with student permission. Why do you want to give feedback on a rough draft? First of all, or partial rough draft. Research tells us that feedback during the writing process is much more helpful than feedback on the product. Number 2, if you can find that error pattern that students are making at the global or the mechanical level after 2 or 3 paragraphs, that's going to be much more helpful for them to get feedback at that point than after they've written the whole paper, and then they can start practicing and applying immediately the skills that you're teaching them. 3, if you collect a partial draft, then you are requiring students again to start thinking about their writing and start going on their writing before the night before, which sometimes is what works out in their world because they're very, very busy. Furthermore, if students write in stages, they don't sit down and say, it's 9 o'clock, I have a paper due tomorrow morning and I'm exhausted and I'm overwhelmed and I can't do this. Instead, they're saying, it's 9 o'clock, I've got half that puppy written and I can finish it tonight. It just makes them feel a little bit more secure. Plus, they've already gotten feedback from you on how to make it better. Finally, this is beneficial for you as a teacher because it's a little less time consuming if you're writing comments on a partial draft as opposed to an entire draft. Now, there's one caveat to that system, and that is you may have a student who comes up to you and says, you know what, I'm a one-draft writer. I just write it once. Now, those students fit into 2 categories. There are the one-draft writers who are one-draft writers because they procrastinate and they write it at the last minute, so that's why it's only 1 draft. And there are one-draft writers who really are one-draft writers. The difference is a one-draft writer visualizes the entire text in his or her head, and they rewrite that text in their head. In their head, they're visualizing the text, rearranging sentences, adding commas, making sentences longer, shorter, and so forth. So a genuine one-draft writer, and according to the research by Muriel Harris, this is approximately 1 out of every 40 or 50 students. That writer will be, again, visualizing the whole paper. So they have written it and rewritten it multiple times before they sit down to a typewriter. They are doing what most of us actually do when we sit down with a draft in front of us and we're rewriting it. My daughter is a one-draft writer. I've talked to her, and that's what her process is, and she says, Mom, I visualize the whole paper. I am rewriting sentences, I'm moving sentences around, and she can do it up to about a 25 or 30-page paper. That is a genuine one-draft writer. That will probably not be the majority of your students. You may have one in every couple of classes who actually does that and does it well. So for those students, if they say, well, I'm a one-draft writer, so I know the due date is Wednesday, but can I just turn it in when the final draft is due? No. If you're a one-draft writer and you want to give me the whole draft the day it's due, great. But I would not give them more time, because then all of your students who are procrastinators will suddenly say, I'm a one-draft writer. So that's the way that you can kind of get away from that issue. Now, the next thing is peer feedback. That's a little tougher to put your fingers around to make sure that peer feedback is successful. So first of all, if you're going to do peer feedback, step number 1 is you need to give your students very specific written explanation about what this process looks like and what your expectations are. And I would have them go back to the rubric, which also helps them as a writer, for guidelines on the kinds of things to respond to. So that's the first part. Second thing, explicitly define exactly how much feedback you want them to get, because otherwise Mary will give a teeny bit of feedback to Letitia, and Letitia will get frustrated because she's given mountains of wonderful feedback to Mary. So define exactly what that would look like. For example, and this is just an example, often if I am doing peer feedback on a paper that's maybe 7 to 10 pages, I will tell the students, what I want to see you do is give me 10 macro level or global level comments, such as thesis, organization, paragraph development, information in the right paragraph, and so forth, having adequate research, etc. So 10 global level comments, and I will also say 2 to 3 of those need to be things they're doing well. Then I will say, in addition, I want 20, unless they don't exist, mechanical convention level comments and marks on the paper. Commas, capitalization, apostrophe, run-on sentences, subject-verb agreement, so on and so forth. And among those comments that are global level, it can be things like, this sentence is not clear to me, or I'm not sure, I think this paragraph is making 2 points, that kind of thing. Again, lead them back to the rubric on the types of global comments that they make. Then I have a point value on that. For every global comment, you get 1 point, and for every micro-level convention comment, you get a half a point. You can make that however you want, but it needs to be very specific. Quite frankly, this would be a better system on my part as a teacher of writing if I graded them on quality and not quantity, but A, that's too time-consuming for me, and B, it doesn't really yield enough to make it worth that extra time. So I do it by the numbers. And you may have a better system, but be very clear on exactly how much feedback they are to give. So next thing along these lines, you will have some of your students who will come back to you and say, I gave a lot of feedback on that paper, and they gave me hardly any feedback on mine, and I'm really frustrated about that. And it's probably the truth. So there's a couple ways that you manage that. System number 1 is tell your student, okay, you may talk to so-and-so and get more feedback. So Letitia, you can go to Joe, ask for more feedback, and then I will talk to Joe also and give him 3 extra points for doing this. Or Letitia, if you have a good friend that you want to get extra feedback, get that feedback from your good friend on the paper. But I will also tell Letitia, who gave fabulous feedback to Mary, back to the Christmas principle. It's better to give than it is to receive. We know that people who give extensive feedback on writing, actually the person giving the feedback learns more and it has more of an advantage to their paper than the student receiving the feedback, which is kind of an interesting switch, but that's how it works. So back to the Christmas principle, if they complain about not getting much feedback, tell them all the work you did is going to pay off for you, as well as the person that you were kind enough to do the work for. Now, there's other things that you can do to set up this process. I'm going to make some suggestions to you, some of which are research-based, some of which are anecdotal on my part, and I'll try to define both so that you know you can better decide what you want to do. So first of all, the research is mixed on this, and that is I suggest that you do a one-to-one exchange. So Mary looks at Letitia's paper, Letitia looks at Mary's paper, Joe looks at Juan's paper, Juan looks at Joe's paper. A one-on-one switch. Because quite frankly, in our busy students' lives, it creates less stress in their world and less structural stress if they're only trading papers with one person. But again, the research is mixed. Some researchers say it's good to do a one-on-one. Other research say have them do it in a small group and pass them around. Second thing, again, you explicitly define how much feedback that you're going to have them do. Third thing, you as the professor put them into groups. And you want to do this because it just saves them time. So you put, again, Mary together with Letitia, and you put Joe together with Juan or whatever. The research is always also mixed because some researchers say it works better if you do this according to skills. Other research says it should not do it according to skills because students can still learn from each other. I tend to do it by topic. I will say, well, your topics are more closely related. I don't put my worst writer with the best writer in my class, but they're not always equal in their skills. And that's intentional because part of the message I'm trying to get across is everybody can learn from everybody. And they can and they do. But understand the research is mixed on that, on which way to do it. Next thing, you need to make very clear definitions on here is when the drafts are due, and also you need to decide what you're going to do when some of those are late. Because you know some of the students aren't going to get their drafts to their reviewer on time, and some of those reviewers aren't going to get the drafts back on time. So how are you going to respond to that? What happens with the late work? How are you going to do points? Are you going to accept stuff later? That's an individual's decision you have to make looking at the calendar and the number of days that you have and the days that are due and so on and so forth. Next thing, this is very counterintuitive, and this one, I've got no research to support it whatsoever. It's totally anecdotal, but I'll tell you it works. And that is completely counterintuitive if, I'm going to go back to my Letitia-Mary scenario again, if Mary reviews Letitia's paper and Letitia reviews Mary's paper, Letitia gets the credit for the comments written on Letitia's paper, not the comments she writes on Mary's paper. Mary gets the credits for the comments on Mary's paper, not the comments that she writes on Letitia's paper. And you're thinking, well, that's counterintuitive. Shouldn't they get the points for the work that they do? True, that is a little counterintuitive, but the other way creates problems. So Letitia turns her stuff into Mary and gets everything on time. Well, Mary only writes 2 comments on Letitia's paper, so that's not really very helpful for Letitia. And she gets it to her late. She doesn't get back to her at all. So Letitia's like, well, I didn't get any feedback and I'm kind of stuck. So my comment is, you are responsible for getting feedback on your writing, because that's what we do in the real world. It's not the editor's responsibility. It's my responsibility as a writer to make sure somebody is responding to my work. And if you don't feel like you got adequate or enough comments from Mary, then number one, you can go back to Mary and say, hey, I want all my points here. So you're going to have to give me more response if I'm going to get all my points. Or you can say, Letitia, do you have a friend that you would trust or someone else in the class that you trust? Yeah, my best friend is a great writer. Okay, go to your best friend for feedback, and then I'm going to grade you on the number of points that you get. Furthermore, if Mary loses Letitia's paper, then Letitia isn't penalized because she still got her own paper and she's ultimately responsible for it. So even though that sounds a little counterintuitive, for whatever reason, it ends up working better with the students. Or that's been my experience. And again, that's not research-based, so you just have to take that as an idea or suggestion. Finally, the last piece is, what do you do with that last draft? As teachers of writing, or teachers of content area when you have writing, it's really, really hard when you get that final draft and you grade it because you want to write comments all over it. Oh, you really did this well, or oh, this could be better, or why don't you do it this way? That's tempting to do, but it's really, really time consuming. And often what we know our students do is they look at the grade, they look at the rubric, and they put it in the trash. They rarely will take those comments at that moment in time and have the opportunity to reapply it. They're not going to rewrite their paper because they got another class to do. So what is best for you is if you give them the grade, you make your comments, whether you're highlighting or circling on the rubric, so that justifies the grade. Now, Exceptions to that, if I have a student who has given me C work and all of a sudden they just wrote out of their head and they gave me a B+ paper, I'm probably going to write some comments because I'm really excited that that student got a whole lot better. The other exception to that rule is, for example, I used to teach a class preparing students to write the thesis so that the final graded paper they gave me actually was going to be a foundation for their thesis and they would be rewriting it. In that case, I gave them extensive feedback on the final draft because it was only the final draft for my class. It wasn't the final draft for them. And you may have situations like that in your classes or programs where what they're writing is part of a greater whole. In that case, yes, it's worth your time and it's helpful to them if you can give them feedback on that final graded draft. Use your rubric, again, to justify the grade and to illustrate their areas of strengths and their areas for growth. And you're saying, I don't really like my rubric, or I don't think my rubric's that great. There's a couple resources you have. One, TLT is great for helping you with rubrics, and they've got some rubrics already available for you that you can modify or not. I have a series of rubrics for content area as well as writing classes at all levels, CAPS level, or associate's level, bachelor's level, master's, and doctorate. So between those sources, we have rubrics available for you. And as the writing director, if you say, I want something completely unique, I will be happy to work with you. So rubrics are available for you from multiple sources. TLT is wonderful. I will work with you, or you can go back to your program director. Any of those resources for helping you get better rubrics. All right. Now, going back to the beginning, why did you watch this workshop? And I think the idea is so that you can give feedback to your students more efficiently. So what were the objectives of this workshop? One, I'm hoping that you gained an awareness of some research-based strategies for responding to student writing. Two, you can apply or use some of these strategies as you respond to student writing. And three, this will save you some time and maximize your efforts in responding to student writing. So back to the story where the grandmother and the mother and the daughter watch cutting off the end of the ham when they don't really need to do that anymore. That's kind of what we're hoping these strategies will help you as a way to fit how you're responding to your student writing in a way that meets what we know today about responding to student writing. Thank you.